Thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from April 19th, 2020. Join us as we continue our study in the book of Hebrews with Pastor Dax.
So we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 8. It feels like a long time since we've been in the book of Hebrews. It's only been a couple of weeks. We're going to be in Hebrews 8, and we're going to look at the first 6 verses from Hebrews chapter 8. And those read like this. Hebrews 8, verse 1. Now the point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. This is the word of our God. There's a favorite passage of mine in Luke's gospel, towards the end of Luke's gospel. It happens on the day that Jesus rises from the dead, and we read of these 2 disciples who are walking along the road from Jerusalem to a place called Emmaus. And Jesus appears to them there on the road, though he conceals his identity from them somehow. And they start to recount the events of the crucifixion and the reported resurrection of this one whom they thought was the Messiah. And Jesus says to them in Luke 24, verse 25, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." So he rebukes these disciples, not because they failed to understand something that was obscure and hidden. He rebukes them for failing to understand something that should have been obvious. He continues in the next verse. He says, "Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And the implied answer is, of course it was. "And beginning with Moses and all the prophets," that's a phrase that captures the entirety of the Old Testament, "he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself." In other words, you're not reading the Old Testament correctly if you're not seeing Jesus there. And then later in that same chapter, later in that same day, Jesus reveals himself to a larger group of his disciples. And while they are left with their mouths hanging open at the encounter, he says to them in Luke 24:44, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." That's another way of referring to the totality of the Old Testament. Verse 45, he says, "Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures." That's something that we must ask God to do for us every time we come to God's word. He opened their minds and said to them, "Thus it is written." So here's what the Old Testament teaches: that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. And then he says, "You are witnesses of these things." The point Jesus is making, in one way or another, all of the Old Testament speaks of me and my saving work and the forgiveness that can be found only in my name. Now, go and declare that message to all who will hear. He says, "You are witnesses of these things." Witnesses of what things? Witnesses of what the Old Testament teaches about how salvation would come through Christ's redemptive death and resurrection. Of that They were to be witnesses. Remember, the early church, the only Bible they ever had was the Old Testament. When you read about the apostles preaching in the New Testament, what do? They use the Old Testament to point to and reveal Christ. In fact, Jesus promises to help these first disciples do that very thing. He says, still in Luke 24:49, he says, "Behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you, but stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high." In other words, the Spirit would come, indwell them, and enable them to supernaturally be faithful to this task of being witnesses to the things written about Jesus. And it's because of that very fact that we today can understand Jesus' instructions about how to read and understand the Old Testament. All we have to do is look at how the apostles, in their preaching, in their writings, how they use the Old Testament to speak of Jesus Christ. Simply read your New Testament. In fact, have you ever tried this before? You could just start in Matthew. As you read through a book, underline or highlight every instance where the Old Testament is quoted. I mean, you can't make it out of the first 4 chapters of Matthew without finding at least a dozen instances. And when you come across those, notice what passage it is being quoted from the Old Testament, when it's quoted, how it's applied. And as you do that, you'll begin to understand something of what Jesus taught his disciples here in Luke 24. The New Testament shows us how to read and understand the Old Testament. Why do I bring all this up? What does this have to do with anything? I mention all of this simply to make the point that the book of Hebrews is a prime example of how to understand the Old Testament. Particularly the way that the writer of Hebrews uses typology. I don't know if you remember back when we talked about typology, it seems like forever ago, but we defined typology like this. There's a type, an actual Old Testament person or event or ceremony that has been designed by God to prefigure and point to the person and work of Jesus Christ, the antitype. And the use of typology really dominates the landscape of the book of Hebrews. If you remember thinking back on this book, in chapter 3, there's Moses and his position to God's people. We find out that is just an imperfect shadow of the position that Jesus would have to God's people. Or in chapter 4, there's the Sabbath that is shown to be an imperfect shadow of the ultimate rest that is found in Jesus Christ alone. Or there's the land of Canaan, the promised land, where God's people are led by Joshua. We discover that that actually foreshadows heaven itself, where God's people are led into by Jesus. Or we spent a lot of time in chapters 5, 6, and 7 looking at this Melchizedek character and how he foreshadows Jesus serving as our ultimate priestly king. And then the last time we were in Hebrews, as we came to the end of chapter 7, we discovered how all of these Levitical high priests, these high priests of the Old Covenant, with all of their sacrifices, how they were actually woefully inadequate. They could never bring sinners to God in a saving kind of way. They were types. They were shadows of the greater substance that which was to come. In fact, if you look back up in your Bible, just back up to chapter 7, verse 27, it says, "He," that is Jesus, "he has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself." It's just a way of proving the point that what the Old Testament priests pictured in this very imperfect sort of way, Jesus Christ actually brought into realization. And as we come to chapter 8, and chapter 9, and chapter 10, it's more of the same, really. We have these series of incomplete, shadowy types that are superseded by greater antitypes. If we try to title chapter 7, "A Better Priest Offering a Better Sacrifice," then we could title this passage here in Hebrews 8, a better ministry occurring in a better sanctuary. And at the very end of this section we're going to be in verse 6, the writer states this very clearly. He says, "But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better." Now, there's a lot in that one little sentence that we won't have time to unpack today. We'll get there in the next couple of weeks here, Lord willing. But the unmistakable point being made here is that the ministry of Jesus Christ is greater. Much more excellent, it says there in verse 6. Much more excellent than that of the Levitical high priests. But why? What is it that makes the priestly ministry of Jesus so much more excellent? And for this morning, we'll simply consider 3 answers to that question. What makes the priestly ministry of Jesus so much more excellent? Here's answer number 1. The priestly ministry of Jesus is much more excellent because his atoning sacrifice is fixed and final. His atoning sacrifice is fixed and final. Hebrews 8, verse 1. Now, the point in what we are saying is this. And be careful as you read that, because this isn't a recap here. He's not saying, let me summarize what I've already been saying to you to kind of wrap it up. What he's saying here is, I'm about to give you the pinnacle, the culmination of everything that I've been saying about Jesus as our high priest. This is not just the main point repackaged, this is the high point. And here it is. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. And I simply want you to notice the distinct posture of our high priest in this verse. Now, as we've moved our way through this letter, we've already mentioned a couple of times that the Levitical high priests never sat down while they were on duty. For all of the furniture that was prescribed by God to be inside the temple where these priests did their work, no place was provided for them to sit. No bench, no chair, no stool. In fact, chapter 10, verse 11 of Hebrews says, "And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins." The Levitical high priest, the Old Covenant high priest, did not sit down inside the sanctuary on duty. Why? Because the work was never done. The sacrifices that he offered, no matter how many he offered, could never truly cleanse anybody of anything. And so, to highlight the much more excellent ministry of Jesus Christ, the writer specifically points out his posture at the right hand of the Father. He is seated. Why is he seated? Because his work of making a once-for-all sacrifice for sinners has been satisfactorily accomplished. It is fixed. It is final. His physical posture in heaven is a manifestation of his triumphant cry from the cross. It is finished. Christ's offering of himself satisfied God's wrath against every sin of every sinner who would ever come to trust in him. And so following his resurrection from the dead and his ascension into heaven, Jesus did what no other priest before him had ever done. He sat down because his work was done. Hebrews 1 verse 4 told us, after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. His sacrifice was fixed and final. In fact, the same point is reinforced here in Hebrews 8, verse 3, where a contrast, or a couple of contrasts, are made regarding his sacrificial offering and the offerings of the Levitical priests. Specifically, there's a contrast in both the quantity and the frequency of the sacrifices. Let's look at verse 3. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices, Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. So first, notice the contrast in quantity. The Levitical high priests offered gifts and sacrifices, plural. Multiple offerings, unending sacrifices. And in contrast to that, the atonement made by Jesus Christ consists of a single sacrifice. Interestingly, that little word in verse 3, something, this high priest also to have something to offer. That word something is singular. It is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer, one sacrifice, in contrast to the ongoing, never-ending gifts and sacrifices of the Levitical priests. So there's a contrast in quantity. But there's also a contrast in the frequency of these sacrifices. There's a little verb there that appears twice in this verse. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. See it there twice? To offer. To offer. It looks and sounds exactly the same in both instances. But in the original language, there is a distinct difference here. The first time that verb is used, to offer, speaking of the Levitical high priests, it is what is called a present infinitive, meaning it stresses ongoing, continual action. So you could read it like this: for every high priest is appointed to keep on offering gifts and sacrifices. But the second use of that little verb, in reference to Jesus, is in what is called the aorist tense. And the aorist tense stresses a snapshot of action, a once-for-all definitive event. So if we just put this all together here, we can see it just rise to the surface. Over here you have the Levitical high priests. They stand to keep on continually offering an unending stream of sacrificial gifts, and yet they fail to actually accomplish the work of atonement. And then here you have Jesus Christ, who in a single act of sacrifice offers himself to God, and when that is accomplished, he sat down. It all points to a fixedness, a finality. The greater antitype has come. Jesus has superseded all other priests. His fixed and final sacrifice renders all other attempts to try to win God's favor null and void. Now, this is not just to add something to your arsenal the next time you play, some sort of theological trivia. It's not just an interesting tidbit here. This point is essential to your well-being as a Christian. You need to understand that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for sinners who call upon his name has satisfied God completely. And so God is not just kind of begrudgingly, against his better judgment, allowing people to come into heaven. No, the fullness of the Father's favor has been won by the death of his Son, and he is happy to receive you into his presence. And it also means that it is very foolish and wrong-headed of you or I to try and earn your salvation through any means of your own doing. To think that your own efforts can atone for your sin and find God's forgiveness. That your morality or religion or good deeds as attempts to satisfy God could ever succeed. In fact, any attempt that you or I make to earn God's favor will leave him feeling decidedly unsatisfied. But he is satisfied thoroughly with Jesus Christ and his atoning sacrifice made in the place of sinners like you and me. And so the priestly ministry of Jesus is much more excellent because his atoning sacrifice is fixed and final. And that is demonstrated in his distinct posture. He is seated. He sat down. Answer number 2. The priestly ministry of Jesus is much more excellent because it reveals his sovereign service. It reveals his sovereign service. So not only, notice here, does our high priest have a distinct posture, he sat down, but he is in a distinct location. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. That title, the majesty in heaven, a similar title is used for God in chapter 1, verse 3, the majesty on high. It emphasizes the greatness and the awesomeness of God. And this distinct location here, at the right hand of God's majestic heavenly throne, is a position of supreme authority and privilege and honor. Sometimes as a kid, I used to imagine what it would be like to be the president of the United States. It's not something I think I would ever actually want to do now. But can you imagine what it would be like to be the one person in the world to hold that unique office? I mean, there's a lot of downsides, but there would be a lot of distinct honor to holding the office of the president. And the point is here, to be the high priest in Israel would be something on a similar level. It'd be equally impressive. You have one man out of the entire nation who is the chief religious leader. All of the history that comes with that, the lineage, the holy garments and vestments he would wear, the incredible responsibilities he had, particularly on the Day of Atonement when he would enter into the very presence of God, all of the respect and authority and honor and dignity that would be given to the man in that role. It's a weighty thing to think about. But when compared to the worth and dignity of Jesus Christ, our great priest in heaven, it's like holding up a flickering candle in front of a million burning suns. 6 times in this letter, Jesus is referred to as being enthroned at the right hand of God. As a result of his redemptive accomplishments, he has been appointed, as we've seen, the greater Melchizedek, a royal priest. And that royal sovereignty is now in view, seated at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. And that distinct location at God's right hand, at the right hand of a ruler, that is reserved for one who not only represents the ruler and acts in the name of the ruler, but also possesses all of the power and authority of the ruler. In other words, Jesus exercises all of God's majesty and might. He has God's sovereign authority as the reigning Lord over all. What did Jesus tell his disciples after the resurrection, right before he gives them the Great Commission? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Ephesians 1 describes the working of God's great might that he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places. Listen, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And he put all things under his feet and gave him as head over all things to the church. The ministry of Jesus Christ is much more excellent because it reveals his sovereignty. And that is demonstrated in his distinct location at the right hand of the Father. Someone put it this way: Jesus' work is performed in heavenly glory, in a dignity that is kingly, and in a power that is divine. Seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. I mean, you read that and you know instinctively that no mere man, no Levitical priest belongs in that position. That is the place for the greater high priest. But now notice something else here about this sovereign, this high priest who sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. He is, verse 2 says, a minister in the holy places. You could also translate it like this: he is a servant in the holy places. A servant. He serves. When is the last time you heard of a king serving? Someone who's seated at the right hand of a throne doesn't serve others, he's served by others. Now, of course, we know that during his time on earth, Jesus served others, right? We know that from passages like Philippians 2, where we're told that he humbled himself and he took the form of a servant. Or in the Gospels, where he says that he came not to be served, but to serve. We understand all of that. But do you realize that the servanthood of Jesus wasn't just a result of him taking on human flesh? Servanthood is also an expression of his deity. All through the Bible, God shows himself expressing his love for people as a servant, in humility, making himself, if I could say it this way, vulnerable, yet always maintaining his royal sovereignty. So think about when Adam and Eve sin. Do they go seek God out to try to reconcile with God? No. God pursues them and makes a sacrifice for them on their behalf. Or in the book of Hosea, how does God portray himself? Shockingly, as a spurned husband who is chasing after an adulterous wife. And of course, what greater act of service is there than to come to us in human flesh? It is God's nature to serve. And that's why, in the New Testament, the term servant is a title of dignity, title of respect. So just get the picture here. Think about this. The ascended Christ, in all of his kingly glory, sitting there in heaven at the Father's right hand, he is the one who receives the incessant worship and adoration and praise of millions upon millions of created beings. And he is in that place, and he serves you, believer. I mean, that sounds ludicrous, but it's true. So just take a deep breath and let that sink in and humble you in a massive way that Jesus Christ, in all of his royal sovereignty, serves you. How does he serve you? Well, not like a genie in a bottle, not like he's a butler at your beck and call. Look at the extended context around this verse here. Just look back in chapter 7 at verse 25. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. You might want to underline that word always. There's no lapse in coverage. There is a constant stream of intercession from Jesus to the Father on the behalf of believers. This kingly priest always lives to serve you. And so we see that the priestly ministry of Jesus is much more excellent because it reveals his sovereign service. God placed him in the supreme place of authority in all of the universe, and with that position and in that place, he lives to serve his people. It's something that makes his priestly ministry much more excellent. And finally, answer number 3. The priestly ministry of Jesus is much more excellent because of the setting in which he serves his people. The setting in which he serves his people. Look at it. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister, a servant in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. The true tent. What does that mean? Well, not true as in the opposite of false, but true as in authentic and real, as opposed to a replica or a copy. Or we might say true as in the heavenly antitype. The greater reality of which the type on earth could only dimly foreshadow and anticipate. And the point being made here is that Jesus serves in the authentic, the real Holy of Holies, not in that portable tent that Moses put up in the wilderness. And that's not to say that the tabernacle was unimportant. It's to say that the real thing is greater and more powerful than the image that seeks to convey the real thing. And why is the writer so concerned that we understand that Jesus is serving us in the authentic holy place rather than in the tabernacle in the wilderness or even the temple in Jerusalem? Why is this such a big deal? Because, friends, if that were the case, we would be in really big trouble. Verse 4. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. If Jesus were on earth still, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. Okay, so follow the argument here. If the tabernacle in the wilderness or the temple in Jerusalem, if that is all there is in terms of a proper place to offer atoning sacrifices to God, then we have a big problem because our high priest is not qualified to serve in those places. Think about this. Jesus did a lot of amazing things while he was here on earth. He healed the sick, he raised the dead, he preached to the masses, he taught in synagogues, he forgave sins, he even called himself God's own son. Never once, though, did he claim the right to serve in God's temple. Never once did he attempt to cross the veil and step into the Holy of Holies. Why not? Because he was not eligible for the Levitical priesthood. He wasn't born into the right family. He didn't descend from the right line to do that. But for this greater priest, offering a greater sacrifice, there would be a greater sanctuary in which to carry out his much more excellent ministry, the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. Verse 5, they, that is, the Levitical priests, they serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. Both of those words, copy, shadow, they have to do with imaging a reality that is greater than themselves. The existence of a copy presupposes an original. The existence of a shadow presupposes something that is real. That's what was going on with the tabernacle in the wilderness. Its ultimate value is the greater reality that it typified, that it pointed to. And one small side effect of that is that meant Moses wasn't free to reach into his own imagination and get creative and invent something or some way that he thought would be really cool and neat as a way to worship God. Instead, he was given very specific and minute details. I mean, you've read those passages before in Exodus, in Leviticus, about the size and the shape and the materials that needed to be used to construct the tabernacle, even down to the color and the kind of fabric. Middle of verse 5, for when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. So think about this here. This is incredible, I think. The antitype, the heavenly tabernacle, the true tent, it's actually the archetype. In other words, what I mean is the reality doesn't come into being after the shadow and copy are built. It already existed before the shadow and copy were built. So it wasn't like God decided one day, hey, I want to build myself a temple. Oh, look at that tabernacle that they built down there. I think I like that. I'll make a better version of that up here in heaven for myself. It's the very opposite. The tabernacle on earth, the place where all of those imperfect priests incessantly offered their imperfect sacrifices, was the shadowy expression of the real thing that already existed in heaven. And now, as the pinnacle, the crowning affirmation about the much more excellent ministry of Jesus Christ, the writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus serves believers not in the replica, but in the original. Jesus is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. The priestly ministry of Jesus is much more excellent because of the setting in which he serves his people. He is in the real place, serving his people. And to show you just how more excellent it is, this passage concludes with yet another contrast with the old order of things. Verse 6, "But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old," now here's the contrast, "as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises." So, how much more excellent is the priestly ministry of Jesus Christ compared to the Levitical priesthood? Answer: as infinitely more excellent as the new covenant is to the old covenant. In every way, Christianity is superior to Judaism. And we'll see more of that next time, Lord willing. But for now, let me urge you, do not turn away from Jesus Christ. Do not turn away from him alone, who is perfectly suited to meet your needs as a sinner. Friend, if you are not a Christian and you are hearing this, you need to know that you stand before the living God in a desperate condition. He sees you in all of your sin, in all of your dirtiness, in all of your guilt. And Jesus Christ is the only one who can meet your needs. He is a perfect priest who has offered a fixed and final sacrifice for sinners. And right now, he is at the right hand of God, sovereignly serving his people in God's true sanctuary by always interceding for them. His ministry is much more excellent than any work you could ever attempt on your own to be reconciled with God. It is much more excellent than what any other priest could ever offer on your behalf. Jesus performs his much more excellent ministry for all who will come to God through him. And so I urge you to come to God through him. Come to this great high priest, and he will save you.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.